All right, let's dive in here. So you can see the agenda for our conversation here on the screen today. But I thought it might be important and special for us to take a moment just to ground ourselves. Given everything that's going on in our country, in our communities, and in the world right now, there's a lot of tension, right? And as we're seeing in the conversations how these unfold and how procedures and policies are being enacted, we know that this conversation that we're going to engage in today is very important. So I would like to just offer up an exercise for us to center ourselves really quickly and engage. This comes from our tool belt that we use here at the national office that we often use in some of our racial healing circles. I don't know if any of you on the line today have had a chance to join us for one of those at our in-person national training events. But this is a centering exercise that we often use to begin these events. So it's called the heart centering exercise. So I can see some of you on camera, and if you're not on camera, that's okay. I'll just use my imagination and pretend that you're moving along with me. But this centering exercise comes to us from the Native American tradition. So what I want you to do is take your two hands, place them in front of you, and rub them together as fast as you can. And close your eyes. Feel free to take slower, deeper breaths as you're doing so. Now envision all of your loved ones that you've been communicating with in this time. Think about your customers that you're serving, your family, your friends, those people that give you warmth and strength in times like these. Continue to think about them as you rub your hands together quickly. Then at the count of 3, what I want you to do is you're going to take your right hand and you're going to put that on your stomach, and then you're going to take your left hand and you're going to place that on your chest. So rub them together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Feel free to close your eyes again. Feel the warmth on your chest, over your heart, and on your stomach. Thinking about the warmth and light that all of your loved ones, your community brings to you in these times. By taking this moment, we're giving this energy to them and we're inviting them into this conversation with us today. This is a conversation about equity where everyone has a seat at the table, and we're inviting them into this space today. May we honor them, and may they be grateful for the contributions that we bring today. One more deep breath. All right. Hopefully you guys are ready to get started. So if you haven't already, here is our agenda on the screen. We're just going to start by going through and highlighting the partnership's commitment to equity. We want to make sure that you all know that, kind of from the roots of our beginning to where we are now, this work is essential to the work of community action. It's in our DNA. So we have the knowledge, we have the resources, and we have the structure to best be able to do this work in our communities. We're going to talk about why we're centering in equity, and particularly why we choose to center those conversations in racial equity, why that is important and why that can't be missed. And then we're going to talk about how we can keep the dream of our network that we were founded and alive by sharing some strategies and tools that we have used over the last 6 years as we've really engaged in this racial equity journey. And then we're going to share some resources and publications. Before I move forward, though, there is quite a bit of background noise. Unfortunately, I can't see exactly who is making what noise because of the view on my screen that I need to share my slides. So I'll just shout out again, if you can please make sure to mute yourself if you don't actively have a question, that would be great. Thank you so much for that. All right, let's keep it moving. So, looking at our society and our communities today, especially in this moment, the conversation and the opportunity for change certainly seems rife, right? There are so many different reports coming out, there's research, there's policies that we see that are going on behind the scenes that contribute to the status quo of inequity that we see in just about all the dimensions of Americans' lives, not just the people that we serve, but you and me on the phone as well. But One of the things that I love so much about community action and that I think is exciting in this time is that we are a network of nonprofits that was founded in a similar time. If we think back to the 1960s when community action was founded, our nation found itself in a similar state of turmoil. Conversations that were taking place made it seem like things would never be repaired, that there was not a way forward, that we would just be lost to the history and practice of what had been going on in our country. But out of that conversation, out of that dissonance, there was a voice of hope. And that voice of hope in many ways was manifested in communities across the United States through the foundation of the Community Action Network. So collectively as a network, we have the resources and we have the knowledge to do this work because this is what we were created to do. We need to continue to follow our North Star, to look into the policies, the practices, and just the power of the Community Action Network to think about how we can do this work and show up more effectively in our communities. The spirit of this work is continued and redefined in our mission and vision statements that the partnership has recently enacted. Back in 2018, the partnership engaged in a review of our strategic communications and the message that we're putting forward to the network. And in those conversations, we were really grounded in the idea that we need to specifically call out the work of equity that is embedded in the foundation of community action. So you can see here our vision statement. This is our vision for us as a network, for you and me, for our agencies, and for our communities. Our vision as members of community action is to create a nation that creates opportunities for all people to thrive, to build strong and resilient communities and ensure a more equitable society. This is our vision as community action. We also took the time to call out our values. You can see all of which are varied and important in doing nonprofit work, but you see equity is at the start because equity is at the center. I specifically want to call out one of our value statements, which I think very strongly ties together our vision for equity in this work and why it's important to our conversation in anti-poverty work. That we believe that all people should be treated with dignity and respect. And we also recognize that structural, race, gender, and other inequities remain barriers that must be addressed. So thinking about how we can restate the promise of community action slightly differently, we know that it states that it changes people's lives and embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, but when you drill down to that, thinking from a place of equity, what we're really saying when we commit to this work is that we believe in the promise that everyone should have access to the opportunity for success. So in line with that, I think it's important to ground our conversation in our shared vision of what we hope for in the future, which is equity, right? If we talk about the data, if we look at serving folks in our communities and the disparities that we're seeing, it's clear that we exist in a society that maintains and perpetuates inequity in many different forms and in many different ways. So if we're going to change this work, I think we need to start with having a shared definition of the future that we look towards together. So the definition of equity that we use at the national level is simply this: a condition whereby all people have access to a thriving reality and belonging, regardless of race, culture, gender, religion, economic status, and social location. This is an image that we often use to kind of describe our process in moving towards this work. If you look at the image on the left-hand side, that's kind of the system that we exist in now, right? Where there are barriers in place where people don't have access to the level playing field. And we've done some work to try to address those inequities, but through the systems that we have in place, you see that everyone is treated equally. But those systems that we have in place don't ensure that everyone has access to thrive, to actually see the game and what's going on, right? As we move to the middle, then, that's what we think about when we use the word equity. those barriers are still in place, but thinking about the different systems and policies that we can use to make sure that those of us that have been historically and culturally treated inequitably, that you get that extra leg up to make sure that you can access and thrive. And we hope that that's just the middle step, though. What we really want through achieving equity is to move forward to that image that you see on the right, which is liberation, where there are no barriers, where everyone has access regardless of where they come from, what they look like, what language they speak. Everyone has access to thrive and to achieve opportunity for themselves, their families, and their communities. So again, what is racial equity? Moving our conversation a little bit more deeply, why we center on race and why that's important and essential in a conversation on equity. But we believe that racial equity is a condition where all people have access to a thriving reality and belonging, regardless of race and culture. So let's drill a little bit more deeply into why it's important to center on race and why that is something that we have to address if we're going to move ourselves forward along that continuum in the pictures that I just showed, if we want to reach a state of liberation in our society. We start with race again, thinking forward. We want to transcend that. And moving into liberation, we need to think about ourselves not as members of specific groups or ideas, but members of one shared human family with a common ancestry, with common hopes, dreams, communities that we share together. We need to do this work together. So now we're going to talk about why we center more on race explicitly and implicitly when we engage in these conversations. This is an uncomfortable truth, but the fact of the matter is that racism, which are ideas and belief systems that ascribe different levels of being or humanity to people based on a group, usually identified by skin color, and structural racism, which are systems and policies that are built upon those beliefs of ascribing value to people based on the color of their skin. Those things are deeply embedded in American history, society, and culture. So as community action, as nonprofit, anti-poverty professionals, if we want to do this work, we have to be honest and we have to realize and understand that we cannot talk about doing anti-poverty work without talking about doing anti-racist work. Those things go hand in hand, due specifically to those ideas, those thoughts, those systems, many of which have been in place long before all of us were here, but continue to contribute to the inequities that we see in our society. So if we're going to do this work, we have to call these things out. We have to know what they are. We have to know when we see them. Was that a question?
No.
Okay. We'll keep going forward. But we have to be able to know these things when we see them. We have to call them out, and we have to understand the relationship to the disparities that present themselves in poverty that we see in the United States today. We often quote frequently from John Powell. He is the head of the now Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley out in California. But he puts this imperative to us as such, that the intersection of poverty and racism is one of the greatest threats to stability in modern day society. Let's look at that a little bit more deeply. Let's put it into numbers. You can see here the statistic on the screen, but research reveals to us that these inequities, again, that are based on systems and beliefs that are grounded in the idea that people of certain races are more important, more valuable, more human than others, it costs our nation almost $2 trillion, trillion with a T, annually, in lost purchasing power, job opportunities, and diminished production for college graduates of color. It's an astounding impact on our society by continuing to exist in these systems, and that continues to impact our communities and our families across the United States. This is important also, not just looking at our present, not just grounding ourselves in what happened in the past, but also looking forward to the future. A lot of the conversations that you hear about what the future of America is going to look like, we hear that we are moving increasingly steadily towards being a majority minority nation, right? That soon, within our lifetimes, for most of us, that children of color are going to be the majority of folks that live in the United States. But if you can look here at the statistic on the screen, why that should be troubling is that while they are projected to be while they're projected to be a majority, we know that with the systems that are in place today, children of color are disproportionately impacted by poverty, which results in a lack of access to opportunity, resources, and thriving in their communities. So think about that. If we continue to allow the systems and structures that are in place, this means that the majority of people living in the United States will be disproportionately impacted by poverty or systems that, again, ascribe value to them based on the color of their skin. It's time to do this work now. And if we think about the opportunity, right, I think that word is oftentimes very amorphous. But when we think about how racism then impacts the different dimensions and aspects of people's lives, you can see here some of the places here on the screen. If you think about education, the kind of jobs that you're able to access, transportation, what kind of food you're able to purchase, what kind of health care you're able to access. So many of those things, holding all other factors constant, the vast percentages of the disparities that we see across groups in America, across these different dimensions, can be defined by race. So holding education constant, holding where you live constant, holding what your parents did constant, just solely by the color of your skin, the course of your life is determined in many of these areas. So let's pick one of these dimensions and drill more deeply and kind of talk about the history, policy, structure, and how that then results in a lot of the disparities that we're seeing in our communities today. Thinking about the simple fact of housing, something that's so tied to the American dream. When you think about being able to have your house and a picket fence, but for so many families, particularly families of color, that was something that was never afforded to them due to structural policies such as redlining, and the impacts of that came out in those times in the 1930s through the 1960s. Many of the policies that continue to exist in communities today result in segregation of housing, and just determined by where people live, that then ripples out to impact what kind of jobs they're able to access, how much they're exposed to the criminal justice system, health risks and disparities, and the education that they're able to attain and achieve. People of color find themselves much more likely to live in these opportunity-deprived neighborhoods and communities. Again, looking back at the history because of the policies that are in place and continue to be in place in many of the communities across the United States. What we are really talking about when we talk about engaging in equity and doing our work as nonprofit human service providers in a more equitable way, it goes beyond those broader dimensions, thinking about some of these specific things that are needed when we talk about equity. Because when we say that, what we are really looking to do for our families is that we want people to be able to achieve well-being. So you can see here listed on the screen some of those different dimensions of well-being when you think about the work that you're providing in your communities. But essentially what we are talking about is we want for people to be able to build a legacy of well-being, not just for themselves and their families, but for their communities. So where are we as a network right now? We all agree that the time is ripe, that the time is now, that we are ready to show up at the table and to do some work about it. So from the national level, we continue to support and say that we are committed to the idea of racial equity. And we want that to be something that is strongly represented and something that is focused throughout the work of the network. You can see that through our vision statements that I went through earlier, but even in our promise for community action, that this is something that we are committed to together. This is urgent work for us, thinking about some of the statistics that I shared before. Many of the things and the solutions that we need are actually long overdue, but it's important if we're going to do this work that we need to do it right. Not just thinking about Band-Aid solutions, not just thinking about having people show up as tokens, but really listening to their voices, really analyzing the problems in our communities. This is urgent, but we're not in a rush to do this work because we need to do it the right way. Looking back at kind of how I've explained some of the context, it's important that we are intentionally leading with race. It is explicit in the way that we need to talk about poverty and the way that we talk about approaching our work as community action, but it's not exclusively the only thing that we focus on when we talk about equity. So race is where we start, but we then know if we're going to engage in conversations on equity, we need to touch on all of those isms, from classism, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, all of those things. We need to talk about those things, but race is the place where we start. And that we are baking racial equity into our work and our policy procedures going forward. So again, it's explicit, but it's also implicit. As I said before, you can't really engage in a conversation about eliminating poverty in the United States without talking about eliminating racism. Those things go together. And as a result, it's important to make sure that we have a strong undergirding of these principles of equity and racial equity specifically in doing our work to empower us to move communities forward. So before I go into some specifics, I want to pause and see if there are any questions. Okay, if not, I will keep going. Again, I will share the reminder that if you can please, if you don't have a question, just to make sure that you're muted. There is a little bit of background noise. I got some chats about it. Some folks are having a little bit of a hard time hearing. So once again, you can do that by hovering your mouse on the left-hand side of your screen, clicking on the microphone icon. When it turns red, you're muted. So with that, we'll keep moving forward and we'll talk about some specific strategies that community action agencies can use to really think about doing this work more effectively. So how can we engage in designing and implementing an equity lens inside a community action agency? What does that look like? Here are some high-level suggestions and solutions for how you can just start to engage in a conversation and to really think more deeply about how to do this work. You can start with what we've been talking about so far, which is to recognize that institutional, systemic, and structural barriers exist that continue to perpetuate inequity in all communities, in all places. This is the status quo of our nation, and it's something that we need to be mindful of. So just being open to engaging in that conversation and understanding that those things are there. Thinking about how you can engage in those conversations amongst your staff, amongst your agency leadership, amongst your board, with members of your community. Thinking about how you can just simply engage and make sure that you're on the same page in terms of understanding a lot of these barriers that exist and the history behind them is a great place to start. Co-creation and co-ownership of solutions. This is one thing that community action agencies are so primed to do that makes me really excited, is thinking about the structure of our board, is that by the very nature of being a community action agency, 1/3 of your leadership is comprised of people who are of or representing the low-income community. When we think about those systemic barriers, we know very likely that means that they are representing the communities of color that exist within your service area. So already we have folks at the table who are ready to engage and listen, but it's time for us to do more in that space. Think more deeply about how we can co-design, and not just co-design, but co-own the solutions specifically with those members of our community. How we can engage customer and family voices, not just as a recipient of services, but as an expert in what they do. They know the problems that they face in their community and their neighborhoods more than we ever will. And thinking about how we can approach them as truly subject matter experts in this work to lift them up and empower them so that they feel engaged to enact the change that they want to see and be a part of in their communities. But thinking about how we can bring people to the table, not just as a voice, but as a thought partner and as a leader. Exploring environmental changes that promote customer success. So thinking about all of those different dimensions, one of the things that we know through our work in community action is that poverty is complex. We're not going to fix the problems just by focusing on education. We're not going to fix inequity just by focusing on transportation. It's how many of those different factors engage and interact together. Again, understanding that many of those systems are, and those inequities through those systems are based on concepts of inequity. So thinking about how we can use our community needs assessment process. Again, this is a great opportunity to engage members of the community, to think about those environmental changes, what changed in your community, what needs to change in your community to help make sure that folks have access to things in a more equitable and inclusive way. This is a big one, but something that is often missed, but making sure that your staff reflects the diversity of your communities. That is such an empowering thing for people to know that when they come into the doors of your organization, they're going to see people that not just look like them, but as a result of that can understand them, can share that level of compassion with them, and can also help to support them and uplift them and think about how they can be a voice of engagement and power in their communities. So making sure that the staff look like the people in your community as much as is possible is really important and a step in making sure that you're moving more towards being an equitable organization. And thinking more critically about how to design and deliver strategies that bridge being served and knowing relationships and mitigating structural bias problems. So again, making sure that those concepts of institutional and systemic racism are present in the way that you're designing and delivering your programs. So one resource that I do want to highlight that I think is really important, where you can find a lot of information on the state and local level, is provided through Race to Lead. They do a lot of work specifically looking at the nonprofit field and looking at diversity and inclusion in the nonprofit world. But not just the work that they do in communities, but if they're talking the talk, but if they're walking the walk. So they do a lot of surveys and a lot of different reports on nonprofits on what equity looks like within the doors of their organization. So how many people of color are included in leadership positions? How many people of a non-Christian faith are represented within their organization? You know, how many people above or below a certain age are present in that organization? And then how does that tie to the demographics that they're seeing in their communities? So this is a great resource to really think about that work. One of their biggest projects that they do every year is called the Race to Lead survey, which really drills into that first piece that I talked about of looking at nonprofits across the country and just taking a survey of what the diversity of their leadership looks like. So I would definitely check that resource out. Unfortunately, we know some troubling from their most recent report. We see that while people of color tend to be the majority of service staff in organizations, there's still a disconnect in people of color being represented in leadership positions in the nonprofit field. So they have a couple of very interesting reports that talk about this work. Let's see. We have a question here in the chat. I'm going to read it out for us. So one of the folks that's on the line today has shared, I have been surprised to find an aversion by low-income African community members to identify racism as contributing to the problems they face. Some seem to feel that calling out racism is an excuse for someone's lack of success. How might we move this conversation forward without disrespecting them? Ooh, okay, that is a very good question and a very deep question. Thank you for raising that. And this is something that we're actually really looking to get more into at the national level as well. But this is not a unique problem. But because of those structural barriers, thinking about the communities and the situations and circumstances that people find themselves in, oftentimes when they look in their communities, those maybe more less opportunity rich communities, and they see people that tend to look like them, they think it's easy for people to kind of miss those higher level steps of those systems and those barriers that are in place that are actually causing the problems that they're seeing in their community. This is actually like a very big point of conversation, and actually one of the end goals of racism, which is to get us to look at that individual level, to ascribe your success and your value in your community solely looking at what you do. That idea of that American dream, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Really thinking about how you can engage in a racial equity conversation is talking to folks about the policies and the history and practice that is in place. And those are the results of the inequities and the disparities that we're seeing in our community. So many of those things come together and coalesce and make it virtually impossible for some members of our communities to be able to support themselves. It has nothing to do with individual value. It has nothing to do with individual, work or willingness, how much you want to do it. But so much of it is based on the policies, the practices, and the systems that continue to create a legacy of disparity in our communities. So I would suggest framing it in that lens, that it's not about individual will, it's not about individual willingness to not want to live in poverty or to live in these situations, but it's about looking at the systems and the policies and the history of what's there and why that leads to so many of the disparities that we see in our communities today. Thanks for that question, though. That was a good one. I'll pause to see if there are any others before I move forward. Okay. If not, we'll keep it moving right along. So as community action leaders, as I've said before, the exciting thing is that we have a long history as a network of moving individuals and communities forward, specifically because of the way that we were designed to include members of the community. But now it's time for us to do more. The numbers are showing us, the data is showing us that the work that we have done, while it is great, it is not enough. We need to use our voice and our presence in the 99.9% of communities across the United States to actively call out and oppose racism in all of its structural individual forms. And we need to dismantle the forces that are pulling our communities apart along these lines. We have such a rich opportunity ahead of us to empower more low-income persons and more diverse people to thrive, to use their voice, to know that their voice matters by becoming active members of their community. And as they are engaged and we increase their potential for social capital, that will revolutionize our communities and truly make America the place that we want to see, a better place to live. So going back to that promise, this is what we want, and this is what we say to ourselves every day as a network in community action, that we believe in the promise that everyone should have access to opportunity. So here are some specific tools that we've been using at the national office. If you would like some more information on how to facilitate these things or where you can learn more, feel free to follow up with me after the webinar. But one of the things that we have been using is called a racial healing circle. You can see the definition here on the screen, but that is a conversational experience that prioritizes perspective taking, empathy, compassion, through calling on our innate need as humans to connect, to feel a part of a larger whole. I can say I've been lucky enough to participate in 3 racial healing circles to date. And it's just an experience, as it said, for folks to really disconnect from so many of those things that seek to separate us and just come together and engage in a conversation about what makes us human and what makes us whole. They're very powerful conversations. We've done that both as a staff. The national board of the partnership has engaged in this process as well. And we continue to facilitate those with you all, with members of the network at our national in-person training events. I know everything is kind of in a holding pattern as things continue to progress in relation to COVID-19, but at this point, we're still planning on hosting our annual convention in Seattle. And at the annual convention, we are planning on facilitating a racial healing circle. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you'll see more from us as we continue to get back to communicating things relating to our annual conference. But again, if you have questions or ideas or want to learn more, please feel free to reach out to me. You can follow up after the email and I can send you some more information. Thinking about, excuse me, some of those internal pieces. Another piece that's been really helpful to kind of get us all and keep us all on the same page are what we call our racial equity conversations. So once every month or so, what we've been doing at the partnership is we just have a brown bag lunch. We all come together in our conference room, all 15 folks on our staff that work in the DC area. And we just kind of open up the table to talk about things that people have seen in the news. So a specific example is maybe a year or two ago when those issues were going on with the 2 young men that were kicked out of the Starbucks in Philadelphia, and kind of all of the conversations that went around along that. We just came together, we had lunch together and just talked about, how do you feel about that? What does that bring up for you? Does that relate to anything that you've seen in your community, that you've experienced yourself? How do you think that we can fix that? And then what can we do as community action to then take these ideas of how we feel and move those forward? Let's see, I think I see a question. I'm gonna try to unmute you here. Give me just a second. If you're able, you might be able to unmute yourself as well. Okay.
Limited, et cetera, et cetera. I gotta yes.
So whoever raised your hand for a question, I think the username was T Pickens. I'm gonna unmute you. You should be able to share your question with us. Having a hard time hearing you. Maybe if you wouldn't mind just typing your question in the chat, I'd be more than happy to kind of raise it out for the group. But it seems like you might be having some audio issues there. So enter that in the chat and I'll be happy to come back to it. But thinking about just how you can engage your staff in these conversations. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or big. It can just be something that you're seeing in the news, something that we know is specifically tied to the inequity, these conversations around race that are taking place in our society right now, in the world right now. How do we all feel about that? And then what does that inspire us to bring to our work in a different way? Another project that is of such critical importance that we can make sure can actively on paper contribute to persons of color in our community being represented and having better access to thriving through the services that we provide and also the services that are available in their communities is the census. The census is still going on. Because the cool thing about the census this year is that this is the first time where the first wave of submitting your responses to the census is being done either online or through the phone. They have over 20 languages available, both online and on the phone, for folks to be able to call in and to make sure that their voice matters and that they are counted. As I'm sure you all have heard, every census is important because it determines the level of public funding that's provided for different facets of services that are available in our communities. But more importantly, it lets us to tell a story of what our communities actually look like in all of their richness and diversity. So if you haven't already, you can engage with us in this effort. The National Office is part of a coalition of organizations that are doing this work to make sure that our communities are counted. So we have a number of different resources. I've talked about why this is important, but thinking about where we are politically, thinking about where we are in policy, thinking about where we are in terms of community. Now is the time to do this work. And this is an important way that we can make sure that people's voices are heard. So you can see here just some different ideas of folks who are typically hard to count. And if you just take a minute to pause and look at this list, these are many of the people that are also often impacted by those intersections of race and poverty that we've been talking about throughout our conversation today. When you think about folks who are low income, when you think about our Native American fellow brothers and sisters, returning citizens, immigrants, rural folks, people of color specifically, people who speak where English isn't their first language, migrants, seniors, all of these people are the most vulnerable in our communities. And they, more than others, need their voice heard. This is an opportunity that they are empowered and they get connected with the resources that they deserve. So I've already talked a little bit about our Census Counts 2020 engagement, but you can see the connections here to where you can find that information on our website. If you haven't already, you can actually sign up to be a part of the Complete Count Committee, both nationally and also in your community. We're trying to provide as much up-to-date news as possible, given everything that's going on right now. But there you can find resources, updates, and you can also nominate folks from your agency, as I said, to be a part of that Complete Count Committee if you haven't already. But you can find that at census2020.com. Let's see, I got a question. And can you define unwired? So those are folks without internet access or folks without consistent internet access. That tends to be people, especially now considering how the census is being done. It's hard to reach those people. So when we say hard to count, those are folks that for whatever reason, either based on, history, whether based on cultural practices or just kind of where they find themselves geographically, that it's hard to get the information out to them to know where they live, who lives in their household, and how to count them. So folks without internet access, particularly in like those more rural areas, it's hard to know where they are and it's hard to get the word out to them. So that's what we mean when we say unwired, folks without internet access. All right, another resource that you can check out is our resource page related to our Immigration Summit. If folks can please make sure to mute, that would be great. Sounds like somebody has us on hold, so. Let's see here if I can go in and mute. But if folks can please make sure to mute themselves, there we go. And I think I found it. All right, so we're back, no longer on hold. Now we're back. But another resource that you can use to specifically think about how you can serve immigrant populations in your community is our resources page from our Immigration Summit that we facilitated last year. This is available on our website. You also have the links here on the slide, but we have specific ideas from legal assistance to current policies to partners in your communities. And also best practices from agencies that were able to join us at the summit, just thinking about how you can be more intentional about specifically serving that, that segment of your community through this work. Here are some resources that you can use from many of our partners that we've engaged with on the national level. As I alluded to earlier, we've been doing this work concertedly and kind of explicitly for about 6 years now at the national office. But again, this is the work of community action. But these are some folks that we've been connected with. We highly recommend these resources if you want to take a look and learn more specifically about policies, practices, innovations, and best practices that you can implement within your organization to think about how to serve your community more effectively and how you can engage in conversations as a community action agency to really think about how you can move this work forward in your communities. Of course, you can visit our website. If you go to communityactionpartnership.com, you click on programs and initiatives under racial equity, you can access our entire library of racial equity resources, both internal and external from our partners. Another resource, it looks like the slides are cut off here. I apologize for that. But if you're thinking about just doing an assessment, if you want to get an idea of where as an organization do you stand when it comes to your policies and systems around equity, this resource is called Creating a Racial Equity Culture. And the organization that developed it is called Equity in the Center. And the process that they use to kind of help you determine where you are is AWAKE to woke, to work. So where your organization stands in these different segments that you see here kind of along the wheel, I know it's hard to read, but from your board to the learning environment for your staff, to your organizational culture, to your communities, how can your organization best assess and rate itself? And it also offers some suggestions on how you can move that work forward based on where you are in their rating scale. Some resources, if you're a bookworm like me, I've read both of these books, and I definitely recommend them. Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist. That tells the story, kind of exactly as the title says, about a white nationalist through engaging in his community, through being welcomed and challenged by people that didn't look like him and didn't sound like him, eventually disavowed entirely the way that he was raised in the white nationalist movement, and now has become a lifelong champion and advocate of racial equity work. Stamped from the Beginning, a definitive history of racist ideas in America. That book kind of charts through, again, exactly as it says, the ideas of where many of these thoughts relating to race and color, focusing more specifically around those ideas of race as it relates to Black people in America, and it charts those ideas through history, where they came from, and how they have resulted in policy across the United States. Both really great books. Our colleagues at the Othering and Belonging Institute, again out of UC Berkeley, every other year they facilitate an Othering and Belonging conference. Many members of the partnership team at the national office were able to go to the conference that they facilitated last year, and they have a plethora of resources, presentations, curriculums that you can use that really delve into various aspects of racial equity and how to actually implement this work. That was one specific tool and resource that comes from the Othering and Belonging Institute, this We the People, practicing belonging in a deep period of anxiety. This is a presentation that was facilitated by John Powell. We Too Belong. This, again, is from the Othering and Belonging Institute, and this specifically highlights policies and practices around immigration and incarceration, and offers suggestions of what folks can do in their communities to move that work forward. The National Equity Atlas, which gives access to some demographics and other disaggregated information about poverty, specifically looking at race. Let's see, my slide deck keeps wanting to jump ahead, but I'm not done yet because these resources are really good and I want to make sure you get to them. The Racial Equity Resource Guide for Community Action. This tool was developed specifically for the Community Action Network by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation as a part of their Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation initiative. This has a number of different organizations, resources, books, and I think even specific racial equity champions in communities across the United States that you can drill into, you can look at, but again, this was created specifically for the Community Action Network, so I definitely recommend that resource. Color of Law. This book talks about the policies and practices specifically relating to housing segregation in the 1930s and 40s, and how that has resulted in a lot of the geographic disparities along race that we see in the country today. Cost of segregation, equity, growth, and community. We have some other resources, again, thinking about an implementation guide. The one here on the right is from Prosperity Now, and it looks into that wealth, the racial wealth gap. So looking at the resources and research behind that. Some other tools here. America Divided is a video series that drills into different high-level overviews of different aspects of racism in the United States, and it features a lot of famous people, so it's kind of entertaining, but this might be something that's really helpful to engage with maybe as a part of those equity conversations amongst your staff. We did that for a certain point at the national office. We would watch one of these, they're all about 15 or 20 minutes or so, and then we would come together and talk about it. So that's a cool resource that you might be able to share. I've talked at you a lot. Thank you so much for your time and attention, but now I want to pause to engage you all in a discussion and a conversation. So are there any questions that folks have about how to do this work, some of the resources that I talked about, or any comments that you'd like to offer about how community action can continue to move this work, particularly now in the environment that we find ourselves in. I'll pause to see if there are any questions. Feel free to unmute or share in the chat.
Vance, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
This is Christine. I was really fascinated to hear that there is a racial equity cultural assessment. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure, the Awake to Woke to Work assessment tool.
Yes.
Sure. So that is a really interesting tool. Let me see if I can go back to it here in the slides. Let's see here if I can get past all of the, there we go, all of the animations that I was very excited and put in here. But this is a really great tool, and it basically walks you through the different gears and levers of your work as a nonprofit, and it helps you to assess where you are in this work. So you can kind of see here on the slide, it's cut off a little bit, but it walks you through 8 different dimensions of what your organization is doing. And it offers like a series of questions for you to then rate yourselves. If you're awake, which means you're thinking about this work, you have, representation of diversity. Let's see. You guys can't hear me. Can other folks on the phone hear me? I'm getting some chats in. Can anybody let me know if you're able to hear me? Okay, all right. So it might just be one of those folks. Just make sure that you're still connected to the audio. Thanks for everybody in the chat letting me know that you can hear. But it walks you through these different levers that you see here kind of on the outer circle of that gear, and it offers a series of questions for you to assess if you're awake, which means you have some diversity, but you maybe don't have a specific strategy on how you want to do this work. You're woke, which means equity is something that is inclusive in your culture. As an organization, it's something that you prioritize, but you might not have a specific implementation strategy, or you might not specifically be doing work at the moment to move that forward. And then that last stage is work, that organizations are holding themselves accountable, not just to diversity of having, a spread of folks at the table, but also looking at that structural piece, and you're actively implementing and doing work to address those things. So it's a very in-depth resource. I would highly recommend it for organizations that are ready to do this work now. Or if you just want to get an idea of how you can move forward in this work, where you even are, it's definitely a great place to start. The link is provided here in the slide deck. When I send that out and share that with Christine, you'll be able to access it there. It's free, so I would definitely recommend that you make the most of it. Did that answer your question? Okay, awesome. Any other questions? Any other comments or thoughts? I might put folks on the spot a little bit. Let's see if I can get forward here. But just kind of thinking about where we find ourselves as a network right now in response to the coronavirus and how that is impacting our communities. We see that that is impacting people. While everyone has the same likelihood of getting sick, we see that in different ways, that this impacts different segments of our community in different ways. If we think about the calls to, limit or to pause, utility payments, when we think about some of the calls that we're seeing for people to actually be released from jail, because sitting in jail right now with this very contagious disease, denies people a basic human right to just health and access. When we think about where people have to go and how far to be able to get tested for this disease if they're not feeling good, how all of these different aspects of structural barriers and racism are at play in this work. I would maybe offer to see if any folks have any thoughts on that they would want to share that we can maybe take together in our time to really discuss and talk about how community action can do this work and serve our communities as our nation finds itself in this, this unprecedented period. Let's see. I see hands raised. I'm going to try to navigate to you here, but if you are able to unmute yourself, please feel free to go ahead if you have a question. You can do that by clicking on the mic, and when it turns gray, you're unmuted.
I know food scarcity could be a real issue right now for a lot of people. In some of the urban areas we deal with, there's not a lot of grocery stores and stuff to get to, and then even the price of getting supplies and food and stuff to be able to wait this out may be a real difficult thing for people to do that we serve.
Right. No, food access is a big concern for folks right now. And not just for your typical customers, but as folks are, as layoffs are happening and as people's, economic kind of well-being is being disrupted, a lot of community action agencies are having to think about how they're going to provide for a new segment of their community, right? So people who might not typically come in to receive services, but because of what's been going on, now find themselves in a place where they need to come to those community centers and to do this work, or to, to get the help that they need. So I think that's a good point. Like, that provides a new opportunity for community action agencies to think about how we can engage folks, not just the people that we typically see. Like, now is a time for us to really engage our communities and to think about how we can move this work forward. But yeah, that's a good point. I know that's a really critical point for many folks in the network and many people in our communities. So it's definitely an opportunity for improvement and to think about how we can move this work forward. See folks saying that a lot of their work is with seniors and they're not able to meet with them right now, and that makes it very difficult. Yes, seniors are some of the most vulnerable members of our communities, and thinking about equity, how can we make sure that they're engaged? When we think about some of the issues that are impacting that segment of our community, when we think about isolation, when we think about health, not just in making sure that they don't get sick, but their pre-existing conditions, if they need medication, they need access to services. Yeah, this is an area where community action really needs to be nimble and to think about how we can meet the needs of those folks in our communities. Let's see. Any other comments or ideas, questions or thoughts? Hey, if not, I think I'm going to wrap up and provide some contact information. So once again, I want to thank you all so much for your time, for showing up in this very critical time, this very busy and disruptive time, to engage in this conversation, in developing a shared language on what this work means and how we as members of community action can show up for our communities, what that means, what it looks like, and what are some tools that you can use to do that work. So if you have any other questions, you can reach out to Denise Harlow, who is our CEO, Tiffany Marley, who is our Vice President of Practice Transformation. And if you have questions specifically about this presentation, you can reach out to myself. And my email is hmckinley@communityactionpartnership.com. Once again, I appreciate your time and your attention today. And this is going to conclude our presentation today. Thank you all so much. Be safe and make it a great day.